Methodology. Dr. Holloway is a medical sociologist with interdisciplinary training in health policy and political economy. She is a scientist with Canadian Blood Services Donation Policy and Studies Department and holds a status position as assistant professor at University of Toronto's Institute of Health Policy Management and Evaluation. She's led numerous projects and been published in a number of highly regarded interdisciplinary journals, including Vox Sanguinis, Transfusion Medicine, BMJ, Social Science and Medicine, the Journal of Clinical Epidemiology, CMAJ, and so forth. And she is a leading expert in Canada on plasma donation, and she leads a SSHRC-funded study on immunoglobulin recipients and their providers. Her scholarship is dedicated to creating health policy that promotes equitable and responsible biomedical innovation, and really looking forward to hear what she has to teach us about qualitative research methodologies, which I think are an underused and a very powerful tool. And with that, Kelly, I will pass it to you.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay, good. So I will talk today about qualitative methodologies and transfusion medicine. And to give you a little bit of a plan, I will start by talking about the philosophical foundations of qualitative research, then identify some of the main qualitative methodologies and provide examples of how some of those methodologies have been applied to the field of transfusion medicine from my own work. And then I'll talk a little bit at the end about how quality is measured in qualitative research if we have time, and hopefully leave lots of time for questions and discussion. So until very recently, qualitative research was considered to be at the very bottom of the evidence hierarchy. And in the last 20 years, there's been considerable movement and recognition about the value and the place of qualitative research, especially in medicine and in health research. And that's due to a lot of advocacy from powerful people in the international research community who've made the case for the necessity of qualitative research in health. So one example is Trish Greenhalgh, who's a medical doctor and academic in primary healthcare and health sciences, who's been a longstanding advocate for qualitative research. And in this letter to the BMJ by Dr. Greenhalgh and 75 other senior academics from 11 countries, they invite the editors to reconsider their policy of rejecting qualitative research on the grounds of low priority. They argue that, yes, some questions are best answered by the results of a randomized control trial or other quantitative approaches, but other decisions and outcomes are more usefully informed by qualitative studies. So those include things like why a promising clinical intervention doesn't always work in the real world, or how patients experience care and how practitioners think, and the relationship between healthcare systems and the outside world, including the organization and regulation of healthcare, but also politics and economics and culture. So many more articles like this followed, and qualitative methods are gaining legitimacy and prominence. But lest you think this is an old question, until last year, the AABB's annual conference had guidelines for scientific abstract review, which instructed reviewers to look for quantitative data in the abstract, so indicating that qualitative data would not be acceptable. So my colleague Jenny Ha raised this as a concern, and that policy was changed, but only in 2024. So this is just to acknowledge that we're still in a position where we're defending the scientific approach and the place for it in health research. When I think about qualitative research as applied to blood, I always think about this lecture by Lawrence Hill. Hill is, he's not a qualitative researcher, he's a Canadian novelist who writes about the history of race in North America. And in 2013, he delivered the Massey Lectures, which are a prestigious series of lectures given by distinguished writers and thinkers in Canada. And he focused on blood, the stuff of life. And in that work, he offered an examination of the scientific and social history of blood and on the ways that it unites and divides us. And it was published in this book shortly afterwards. So he says, blood is truly the stuff of life, a bold and enduring determinant of identity, race, gender, culture, citizenship, belonging, privilege, deprivation, athletic superiority, and nationhood. When we think about our work in transfusion medicine, we're often focused on the science of how to collect and process and deliver blood safely so we can save people's lives, and that should be our focus. But we should also recognize that because blood is part of a person, it is understood as a part of a family, a culture, a history, a country. And qualitative research is a form of scientific inquiry that can allow us to systematically investigate what blood means to different people in that system. So from the donor to the recipient, the technician, the clinician, funders, and regulators, and also how those meanings shape and are shaped by broader social conditions like the healthcare system, and even more broadly by politics and history. Through qualitative methodologies, we can begin to understand those complicated social questions that impact our work of saving lives. So what are some areas where qualitative research is best suited to answer the problem? One is where a problem needs to be explored. So for instance, how do we recruit donors for convalescent plasma in the context of a pandemic? Another is a need to study a group that is not easily measured. So for instance, children with blood disorders. There isn't a lot of research in this area so far because of ethics and because of access. That means we don't hear from those people and their experiences. And qualitative methods can offer a way in to hear silenced voices. So communities that don't trust scientists and health systems because of a history of unethical practices, for example, Indigenous communities, because you need a complex, detailed understanding of the issue. So for instance, why do people sign up to the stem cell registry and then not proceed to donation, which is a project we have on the go at the moment? When you want to empower individuals, so for instance, we've used community-based participatory research to understand why racialized people have barriers to donation. When you want to write in a literary style, so for instance, my colleague at U of T in nursing, Dr. Quinn Grundy studied nurses' interactions with pharmaceutical and medical device industries. And in her book on her findings, she started with her own experience with device industries, kind of recruiting her to come to their dinners and talk to her, and then wove that personal story into her results and her findings and the story of her book. To understand the context or settings in which participants address the problem, so a lot of work on how the COVID-19 pandemic changed the context for how people understand things like public space and access to health and vaccines, to follow quantitative research and explain the mechanisms or linkages in causal theories. So not to replace quantitative research, but to add to it to answer the questions that haven't been answered. To develop theories when partial or inadequate theories exist. So for instance, a lot of the work on donor motivations that has been done internationally focuses on this concept of altruism. And it's a limited concept which we've tried to unpack and further investigate with more empirical research. And then finally, because quantitative measures don't fit the problem. So those are some reasons why we would do qualitative research. I'll now get into the philosophical foundations of qualitative research. And I'm doing this because there are different assumptions at play when we do qualitative research than when we do quantitative research. And sometimes if those are misunderstood, we don't have the proper criteria to evaluate what looks like quality and rigor and empirical study with qualitative methodologies. So all research is based on philosophical assumptions, which are just the abstract ideas and beliefs that inform our research. Those assumptions provide direction for our research goals and outcomes. So how we formulate a research problem is shaped by our philosophical assumptions. They relate to training and research experience, where training and scholarly community reinforce how we think, the tools we use, how we employ them. And they inform evaluative criteria. So how we determine the quality of a study. If you think generalizability is a measure of quality for all scientific research, then you would conclude that most qualitative research is of poor quality because that's just not its aim. In the social sciences, we're trained to think about our philosophical assumptions very extensively. And often that begins with a critique of what's called positivism, or the belief that valid knowledge can be generated only from objective empirical observation carried out according to the scientific method. In the natural sciences and also in clinical research, often that is the unstated assumption. But that assumption becomes difficult to uphold when we're studying human behavior because we see that people have different perspectives and experiences based in their identity, their history, their culture, their location. And we start to question the idea that there's only one correct story about human experience. From there, qualitative researchers recognize that reality is complicated and we come to know it from our experience. And thus the purpose of scientific inquiry can shift accordingly. So while for researchers from a positivist perspective, seek to predict or explain causality, another objective of scientific inquiry could be to understand the multiple, complicated, and contradictory character of human experience and behavior, or even to emancipate or liberate, or just to deconstruct ideas so that we can rethink what we currently understand as fixed and constant. So that way of thinking, where we understand reality to be multiple, comes from a philosophical foundation called interpretivism. Qualitative methodologies build on historical traditions that question our ability to completely know the truth about the world through empirical methods. In essence, interpretivism is the assumption that we can never objectively know the truth about the world. We're humans, we're trying to understand the world through methods that we create. And when we study people, all we can know is how people interpret the world from their own personal, historical, and cultural perspectives. So interpretivist approaches to make explicit the scientific bias and perspective that influence data collection and analysis. The researcher would be open and transparent about those perspectives. An interpretive research question is more like, how do historical experiences with health systems and blood services explain why some people don't donate from their perspectives? An interpretivist research outcome emerges from scientists' interaction with the participants, and all of the interpretations presented are considered contextually dependent. So the participants' identity, history, culture are seen as factors that can influence how each person interprets, understands, and makes meaning about their experience. So on the right-hand side of the slide, these are just some of the interpretivist frameworks that inform qualitative research. Positivism, post-positivism, is based on the idea that humans can never know reality perfectly, but multiple methods are used to identify the most valid findings. Social constructivism highlights the multiple realities that human beings construct through interaction with their social world. Transformative frameworks and critical theories like feminism, critical race theory, disability theory, seek to understand in order to change society. Postmodernist frameworks seek to deconstruct the complicated ways in which human beings create meaning through language and discourse. Pragmatism uses all necessary approaches to understand a research problem. And then I've added Indigenous methodologies, which I'm still learning about, but these are complex and diverse and stem from traditional ways of knowing from a long history of Indigenous culture and practice and aren't limited to qualitative research. One way of describing this approach is with reference to the medicine wheel, which has been used for thousands of years in Indigenous research. That wheel with the 4 quadrants illustrates balance and wholeness and can have many meanings and applications. And as a theory, the medicine wheel uses stories, traditional knowledge, and interconnectedness as a basis of viewing the world. So just to kind of finish off these philosophical foundations, most qualitative researchers, I would argue, hold the following broad philosophical assumptions. So ontology is the branch of philosophy that studies reality. the belief from many qualitative researchers is that reality is multiple. So when qualitative researchers conduct a study, they aim to report multiple realities. This doesn't mean that every reality is true. It just means that there's more than one that can be considered true. Epistemology is the branch of philosophy that studies how we come to know what's real. So qualitative researchers try to get close to the worldview of the participant being studied. And that is how we come to know the world. And axiology is the study of value and involves morality and ethics. Qualitative researchers make their values known in a study. We talk about where we're coming from, what we believe, and our assumptions throughout a study. And we position ourselves by identifying who we are in relation to the context and the setting. And then methodologically, qualitative researchers often do research that is more inductive. So we start with the data and move outward. It's more emerging. It's shaped by the researcher's experience in collecting and analyzing data. So just to review, these are some features of qualitative research methods. The researcher is the key instrument. The researcher is the one who's interacting with participants, engaging and interpreting what they say. We begin with philosophical assumptions and we situate ourselves in our assumptions and theories before we even start the research. We use interpretivist or theoretical frameworks to inform the study. It's ethical at every stage. We focus on research problems addressing the meaning individuals or groups ascribe to a social or human problem. It is an emergent approach to inquiry, so we're constantly learning as we go and changing. The question might evolve as we do a study. We collect data in a natural setting that is sensitive to the people and places under study. So we don't try to create a controlled environment. We watch people, we understand people in the environments that they're living in right now. And then data analysis can be inductive and deductive and establishes patterns with multiple levels of abstraction. Just to go through some of the tools that we use and the way that we would formulate a research question. Qualitative research is ethical at every stage. We have to comply with the TCPS2 for the Tri-Council policy involving human subjects. But in doing that, we comply with principles of ethics. So respect for persons in terms of providing evidence of measures for respecting privacy and ensuring that the process is clearly communicated. Concern for welfare, ensuring adequate protection of participants and providing evidence that we don't place participants at risk. And then justice in terms of treating people fairly and equitably. And more than just applying to a research ethics board to ensure the study meets these criteria, we practice situational ethics, which means that we continually attend to these principles throughout the research process. A good qualitative research question is open-ended and evolving. So often we don't have a hypothesis. We have a question that is open enough to continue learning throughout the process. It's not cause and effect. So we ask how something happened, not why. It reflects the particularities of the study. So we don't try to say from one study that we can then generalize to all of human beings. We focus on the context that we study. And then it implicitly or explicitly makes a link with theory, either through choosing a methodology or through engaging with theoretical work. This is just some examples of research questions from a textbook that I use when I teach qualitative methods. I'll go through these methodologies in a moment, but this gives you a sense of how the research question changes given the methodology that you choose. And there are signifiers in the question to demonstrate how you are using that methodology. So we distinguish between methodologies and methods. And often when people talk about qualitative research in the health systems context, they talk about interviews and focus groups and observations, maybe even the use of documents or artifacts. And those are the tools that we use in qualitative research, but they're the technical tools that we use to conduct research. Usually those tools are used within a broader methodological framework And methodology is the theory that underpins research design. So on the left-hand side, you'll see the different research designs that I'll go through in a moment. And then those designs will use different technical tools. So often for ethnography, we use observations, but we also might use interviews. In grounded theory, we often use interviews, but we also might use focus groups. So your selection of methods is important for the appropriateness given the methodology. And then the interpretive framework that you select also comes into play when you're making these decisions about how you're going to select a methodology and how you're going to select the appropriate methods. So just to kind of give you a sense of how we start that work, how we integrate our philosophy and interpretive framework, we start with a perspective and experience that we want to bring to our research. We think about how our beliefs guide our actions as a researcher, and then how our philosophical and theoretical frameworks inform the choice of research approach. And then we think about how does the research approach influence the methods used for data collection, and then what contributes to our decisions related to rigor and inferences and use of findings. So this is kind of how I try to teach how to do this. The concept of methodological congruence means that you consider all of those things when you're designing a research project. The purposes, methods, and questions relate to each other, and the theory, methodology, ethics, literature, and interpretive framework will all contribute to the congruence between those three central ideas. Okay, I'm going to move on to talk about some of the key qualitative methodologies now. One is ethnography. So ethnography is where the researcher describes and interprets the shared and learned patterns of values, behaviors, beliefs, and language of a culture sharing group or culture. So ethnography involves extended observation of the group, most often through participant observation, in which the researcher is immersed in the day-to-day lives of the people and observes and interviews the group of participants. The aim is to study the meaning of participants' behavior, their language, the interaction among members of the group. And while traditionally this methodology comes out of anthropology and a tradition of studying other cultures or distant cultures or even quote unquote exotic cultures, there has been a real reckoning and criticism of that approach, because who is studying a culture really matters for the ethics of how you're going to study a question and how you're going to interpret a culture that is not your own. And the history of anthropology is tied up in a project of colonialism. So now there's a lot of work in anthropology and specifically with the methodology of ethnography to reconsider what culture means, to study cultures that are closer to home and study our own cultures. Narrative inquiry is the exploration of life in one or more individuals using experiences as expressed in lived and told stories. So narratives are storied ways of knowing and communicating. If you think about how you tell the story of how you broke your leg, how you found, your partner, how you entered grad school, the way that you tell your story will communicate the facts of the story, but also how you have processed it and what you wish to convey with your story. So narrative inquiry considers the story as the object of inquiry and analyzes story making. Narrative analysis begins with experiences as expressed in lived and told stories of the individual. Researchers collect stories about those lived and told experiences, sometimes through interviews. Sometimes they will take a text that has been produced already, like a journal or a biography or even social media. And then the researcher would explore the cultural and social and familial and linguistic attributes of that narrative that's being uncovered. Phenomenology is a research approach that studies the common meaning for several individuals of their lived experience of a concept or a phenomenon. So the focus is on describing what all participants have in common as they experience a phenomenon like grief or insomnia or illness. The aim is to describe the universal essence of the experience, and the researcher would collect data from people who have experienced a similar phenomenon and then develop a composite description of what they experience. There's a lot of philosophy to this methodology, and researchers who engage in phenomenology, who use this methodology, have to do a lot of reckoning and exploration of the philosophical foundations of this methodology more than the other one. So I find it very intimidating. Grounded theory is a research designed to move beyond description to generate or discover a theory from a process or an action. There's a concentration on what people do and the meanings that they make of their actions and situations that they're involved with. So this was developed by sociologists who felt that theories used in research were often inappropriate or ill-suited for the participants under study. And they advocated for the idea that theory should be grounded in the data. We should start with the data in the field, in the actions of individuals and how they describe their own social situations, and then develop theory from there. Case study is about studying a case within a real life contemporary context. So this is not a case like one individual. The case can be a group, an organization, a workplace, or an institution, as long as it is bounded. So that means you have to define the case, where it begins and ends and where it was located. It's a choice of what is to be studied within a bounded system by time and place. And then the investigator explores a real-life contemporary bounded system or multiple systems over time through multiple sources of information. So it can include observation, interviews, audio-visual materials, documents, and reports. Community-based participatory research sometimes is called a methodology, but often it's called a research framework that can be paired with other methodologies. And it's an approach that attempts to emphasize redressing power imbalances between researchers and research subjects, often with the aim of affecting social change. It gained prominence in the 1970s with research on oppressed communities in South America, Asia, and Africa. It came out of work by Paulo Freire, who was a Brazilian educator, and introduced this dialogical method of co-learning and action based on critical reflection. So the key tenets are to co-learn processes with community members. It's a political process that involves lay people in theory making, and it's committed to improving social practice by changing it. I touched on Indigenous ways of knowing. I'm still learning about traditional ways of knowing. This book by Margaret Kovac is incredible and details the philosophical overlap between Indigenous ways of knowing and some approaches to qualitative research. So these are just some of the principles informing Indigenous ways of knowing: that it centers Indigenous knowledge. We do research in a good way. It ensures trust and following principles of Indigenous data ownership and situating oneself in the research project. So I would not seek to use Indigenous methodologies in my research projects without the guidance and partnership of Indigenous scholars, because I'm not Indigenous. But what I do think is necessary is to recognize these methodologies as important and legitimate forms of inquiry that have existed for centuries. And we have a lot to learn from these teachings. And then finally, what I want to call applied qualitative research. So there's a version of qualitative research that exists mostly in health services research, which is entirely aimed at informing and guiding a policy or process. Sometimes an organization will employ or commission qualitative research to gather in-depth insight about how people experience and understand a problem. And that work can have a long-term focus and advanced theory, but usually it's undertaken to address an operational challenge or a policy question with a relatively short timeline and with specific aims. So this work is pragmatic in nature and may not it may not follow a formal methodological approach. Sometimes approaches will use what is called qualitative description, which is a straight description of a phenomenon that offers a comprehensive survey of an event or practice. Another approach to applied qualitative research is called thematic analysis, which stems from methods in psychology, and is now applied to many other settings. Two scholars kind of have championed this approach, Braun and Clark. Originally defined the approach in 2006 with a paper that has been cited very frequently, but Braun and Clark continue to engage with that idea of thematic analysis. They have written extensively about when it should be used, when it should not be used, how it is used inappropriately in many contexts. So if that is of interest, I would recommend reading all of their work. So these approaches may not allow us to expose or challenge underlying conceptions of a group in society or really fully understand a social phenomenon, but they can help bring about change and quality improvement and be readily understandable by those being studied and motivate action by keeping the description close to the everyday language of those being studied. So in the last 10 minutes, I think, I'll just talk about some of my own work and how I've applied these methodologies in transfusion medicine. One project I'm still in the middle of is about addressing systemic barriers to donation for diverse South Asian communities. So we know that most of our donors are white in Canada, and racialized people are underrepresented in donation. It's very hard to study people who don't donate because they might not have any connection to donation. So how would we even begin the conversation? And the way that we've tried to do this is by partnering with communities that do have some connection to donation and then asking them to work with us to reach out to their broader communities who don't have a connection to donation. So in this study, we have worked with Sikh Nation and St. Aaron Carey Mission and the Canadian Centre for Muslim Women in a partnership to explore systemic barriers to donation for people of South Asian ancestry, and then obtain feedback on recommendations and strategies to address those barriers. So we used community-based participatory research. We held qualitative focus groups in the community, and we also reached out to students on university campuses. We have a publication that came from the first phase of this study in PLOS Global Public Health, and another one is under review. I've also conducted what's called focused ethnography. So when we started our plasma proof of concept back even before the pandemic, we set up 3 plasma collection sites in Canada, in Sudbury, Lethbridge, and Kelowna. And they were specifically dedicated to collecting plasma for immunoglobulin and other plasma-derived medical therapies. So I did some ethnographic research in one of the proof of concept sites for plasma collection, and it happened to be during the pandemic. So I spent a week there. I did participant observation. I spoke to nurses and phlebotomists, employed the theory of emotional labor, which is about managing emotions to portray an emotional state in the workplace. And that helped us to understand how people in the center were experiencing the transition, moving from whole blood collection to plasma collection amid a global pandemic, and how they found it challenging, but adapted by coming together and putting the donor experience first. And that allowed us to come up with some policy recommendations for recognizing the value of emotional labor for the impact on the workplace. That's a publication that came out of this work. From the work that I did on plasma donors, I kept hearing about the fact that plasma donors don't understand where their plasma is going, how it is manufactured into medicines, what illnesses it can treat. It's a complicated story, and donors really wanted to know that story. They wanted to kind of gain purchase to know that they're having an impact. So I did a study about immunoglobulin recipients where I did narrative analysis with patients, and I talked to them about their lived experience of illness, diagnosis, and treatment so that I can understand their stories and how plasma was having an impact on their lives. Narrative inquiry allowed me to focus on their stories. They told me their life stories over multiple interviews and hours on Zoom. And we were able to trace the participants' experience from pre-diagnosis to diagnosis and treatment, and how that produces uncertainty and the paradoxical nature of getting a diagnosis, because it can feel like both a miracle and a burden. So that's a publication that came out of that work. So I'll just conclude by talking about quality and qualitative research, because you have different measures for quality that need some explanation. And now that you know the philosophical foundations of qualitative research, these will make more sense. So qualitative research is not generalizable. We don't seek to generalize to all of human beings or the general population. What we seek to do is offer deep contextual understandings of a topic. And that means that we can have a sample that is a lot smaller than a quantitative study because our objectives are different. It's not quantifiable. We don't use numbers in the same way that quantitative studies do. We don't aim for statistical generalizability. It's not hypothesis testing. We often don't start with a hypothesis or a deductive approach. We seek to generate understandings and theories. And it's not replicable in the way that quantitative research is. So we don't ever claim that you can reproduce the study exactly, because human experience is complicated and contextual. You can do the same study in a different place and come up with different results. And if you are transparent about how you're doing the work, how you are reflecting on that process, it's still valid. So these are some questions we ask when we are looking for quality in a qualitative study. Do the research questions drive the data collection and analysis? To what extent are the data collection and analysis techniques competently applied? Are the assumptions made explicit? Does the study have overall warrant? Does the study have value in informing and improving practice? And then is it ethical at every step? There is a great article by this author, Tracy, who's in my references on the top 10 big tent criteria for quality and qualitative research. And in that piece, she really nicely explains why the measures of quality for quantitative research are not necessarily transferable to qualitative research, but that we can think of their equivalent, and we can think of the way that we take up quality measures in qualitative research by thinking through these concepts. So I won't go into great detail about what each of these mean unless you want to talk about it in the discussion, but I'll point you to that piece if you want to look for it in the future. And I will end by giving you a plug for a textbook that's coming out next year. So Quentin Eichenbaum commissioned this textbook through AABB. It's called Research Design in Transfusion Medicine. And as a measure of the progress that we've made in recognizing qualitative research as a legitimate form of inquiry, this textbook features an entire section on qualitative research in transfusion medicine, edited by Mickey Zeller and Jenny Ha. And I have some chapters in this book, and there's some really incredible work that's been done by all of the other authors. So it's going to be hot off the presses next year, and I recommend. Those are my references. Thank you very much.
Kelly, that was fantastic. Thank you again for speaking on this subject. And I've always felt that qualitative research is something that is really underutilized, particularly in the field of transfusion medicine, where we're so concerned with understanding why people do what they do, whether that's physicians or patients, or even why the results of quantitative research fail to change practice. I think it would be an area of great inquiry for qualitative research, just in terms of knowledge translation. I think it has the advantage that you don't need a huge, research team to conduct it. It doesn't require nearly as much money to conduct. It's amenable, I think, for young investigators that way, who are trying to map out what questions we even need to ask, like what hypotheses we would even need to test. So I think it has huge potential. I can say, as someone who sort of ventured into this area myself, I really felt like I had absolutely no idea what I was doing. The time I tried to use it was when we were trying to introduce transfusion camp in Rwanda, and we came in with our usual quantitative metrics, like the pre and the post test scores, and on a scale of 1 to 5, how much did you like coming to transfusion camp today? And those were, give you something, but when our remit was, can you improve transfusion practice in this country? I think we all understood, we need to really understand exactly what's the environment here now before we, like we needed a deeper understanding. And I knew that that required a qualitative approach, but I literally just like Googled, how to answer this, and I came up with something called interpretive description, which looked reasonable, and we put out some uh, you know, little tape recorders for focus groups, and we listened to people talk and sort of, just chat about various subjects, and then we transcribed it, and we got some good stuff out of that, and it got published. But I almost felt like, I still feel like we were kind of faking it, like it wasn't really rigorous. And I guess the question would be like, what should I have done differently? Like, what if someone knows that a qualitative research would be really useful and they don't even know where to begin? Should they get that book? Should they try to find a qualitative researcher like yourself to collaborate with? Like, what's the first step?
But that sounds like such an interesting study, and I'm going to go find that paper now.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, it's such a good question because I don't want to be a gatekeeper for people who want to do qualitative research and they're in a position where they have access to a population that has so much to say, right? Like so much important information to be collected. But at the same time, given this whole history of how qualitative research has been challenged in terms of whether or not it's a real scientific approach and if it's rigorous enough, it does matter to me to do it well, right? So I would say there are levels at which you can learn how to do this work. You can start with textbooks. So the textbook I use to teach my students is Cresswell and Potts, um, sorry, what's it called? Choosing among the 5 approaches. So Cresswell and Potts is a place to start. There are many textbooks that give you an overview of qualitative research and how it's done. The textbook that's coming out from AABB next year will be helpful. I would also recommend, seeking guidance and partnering with an experienced qualitative researcher. And then if it is something that you want to keep doing, then look for educational opportunities to gain that expertise. So at IHPME at Delawana at U of T, we have a master's where you can focus on a qualitative research project. And if that's of interest, you can do it part-time. So there are lots of ways to kind of get an entry in. Yeah.
Yeah. Christine.
Sorry, I'm slow on my buttons. That was so fascinating. Thank you for opening our minds on this method. I was wondering, what are the kind of rules, best practices, constraints on leveraging AI in processing the volumes of transcribed text in qualitative research when it comes to doing thematic analysis and efficiently, and maybe we could say in a less biased way than a human would do, extract key points in a comprehensive way. Like, is that kosher?
It's a great
Yeah,
question.
I will. It's a really good question. It's very relevant now. Like as I'm teaching qualitative methods over the past 5 years, it's becoming more and more relevant to how students want to learn. I have a lot of reservations about using AI at all, especially for any qualitative data analysis. As I kind of tried to describe, the process of doing data analysis in qualitative research is an interpretive act. So we do all of that work to situate ourselves, to be transparent about our assumptions, to think about our interpretive framework, so that we are honest about how we are understanding the data. and that engagement with the data is importantly done by the researcher. So AI has a bias, and that bias is not transparent, and it's not a good quality outcome when you use that tool to do the analysis of data. The other ethical issue is that we're collecting data from participants and we are promising them privacy and security of their data. When we enter transcripts into an AI tool, I don't know enough about how those tools are organized to ensure that those transcripts are kept private and confidential. So I have lots of thoughts and reservations, but I feel like I need to think more about this because it's being used all the time.
It's an interesting point. We trust more in the freedom from bias in those who've had sensitivity and compassionate backgrounds. Like AI has no compassion, and in fact, we know that, or we understand that it may actually even be recreationally inducing suicides for all we know, right? These terrible stories. So we I take your point that we can never assume an objective goodwill, and given that it's processed everything, it does have the residue of societal biases, whether or not it's been trained to be politically correct and the way it delivers answers. So that creates an illusion of non-bias that may not actually be true. Um, but it's almost like we're saying that a human is entrusted with having had a sensitivity background, such as yours. You speak so compassionately as well on the indigenous perspective. Like not everybody talks like you do, right? And so, I wonder if there's going to be a split in this world of research, because my concern is not everybody is trained to be as conscious of their bias, right? Not everyone has done implicit bias testing who goes into this research. And how do we know that they too have been processed in a way that makes their perspective or their interpretation safer than technology?
Yes. I don't know how to answer that.
Yeah.
Excellent question.
Do you see a schism emerging in
Yeah,
amongst experts in your own craft? Like, will there be guidelines coming out on this?
I do. I don't know if I would call it a schism, but it's definitely an emerging problem that needs to be addressed. And I don't know, I would call it a problem, maybe others wouldn't, but I think I'm seeing more journals asking for information about how exactly you have used AI in your analysis. I'm seeing journals asking for more transparency around it, which I think is a good thing. But I also am hearing about AI generating whole entire articles that the author didn't write or know about. So I don't know how to get my hands around it. I'm not sure if I'm the right person to create those guidelines, but I feel like this is an important time for them to start to take place.
It's so interesting because like schools now have AI detectors, and there are AI detection, anti-detection software that reprocess work to make it not look like AI. Like my cousin's son, who's working on an engineering degree, was telling me how many AI technology layers there are to make it look like you didn't use AI when you did. It's insane.
I think it would be great to have an entire session on AI within the research environment next year. I think there's so much to
Mhm.
be said about it. And you're right. Like, you now see in journals that, people will say, I just read an article the other day that, the last paragraph was, I wrote this with AI, I wrote this with ChatGPT, and I went back and edited it, and everything. But that was part of their disclosure. And it did remind me in a way of all these like medical anthropology articles I read as an undergrad, where the author would sort of say, I'm coming at this from this background, and I have these values or what have you. And you see that in other places too. Like, like you look at things like chest guidelines for antithrombotic therapies, and they'll say, we value this more than that. That's our bias. And so the whole idea that you can eliminate bias, people are just sort of saying can't be done. the best thing you can do is be transparent about it. And I think the fact that you can't be transparent about bias in AI is the problem. Like, unless we can treat AI to sort of reveal its own biases in a way.
No.
But it's I think, and Andrew had a comment in the chat field as well, that there's every AI platform has its own biases. So it's, anyway, that's a whole other subject. Does anyone else have any questions or comments they wanted to raise? Fatima, or you're applauding, sorry. Okay. All right. Well, listen, if there are no further questions, we can wrap up. Kelly, thank you again for presenting on this topic. I do think it's an area we need to really pay more attention to, and I share your enthusiasm for having a whole chapter on it in a research tools textbook like that. I think it's got huge potential. Okay.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Just before we go, I will ask everyone when they are signing off to complete the evaluation that we do rely on for these sessions, and just to remind you as well that next month we will have Deb Siegel speaking on explanatory versus pragmatic trials, even more quantitative questions, but again, really interesting subject that she has a lot of experience in. So we will see you then. Okay, thanks so much, everyone.